Okay, I'm going to try to do two or three things in this video lecture. I'm going to give a kind of synthetic overview of some of the important trends in this period that we call the High Middle Ages. This is roughly the 11th through the 13th century, 1000 to 1300. Obviously, those are nice round numbers and don't really mean anything, but just to give you a sense of the chronology here. And then I want to talk about some specifics about a couple of these. And so hopefully we can get through all of that in a timely fashion here. So one of the things that we have to acknowledge that happens in the High Middle Ages, especially relative to or when compared to like the late 9th and the 10th century, is the stabilization of Europe, right? With the collapse of the Carolingian kingdom, Europe entered into this period of instability. There was definitely a desire for order, and some regions were able to achieve greater stability than others. We talked about, for instance, that some of these Vikings settled permanently on the continent and in the British Isles, and were able to establish relatively stable political entities like the Duchy of Normandy, or even this thing in England called the Danelaw, which was a Danish king ruling over, the northern and eastern parts of England for a century or so. But a lot of regions were still, cursed with endemic warfare, and it was just a really unstable period of time. A number of things lead to greater stability. One of these is this interesting movement called the Peace of God, and I'm going to just mention that here, and I'm going to circle back to it later in the lecture, talk about some of the specifics of it. But this is an alliance of mostly churchmen, bishops, abbots, leaders of ecclesiastical institutions, along with, maybe surprisingly, peasants. Basically, the people who had suffered from the intense violence of this unstable period got together and said, we're not going to take this anymore, we're going to do something about this, and using the tools they had at their disposal, which is mostly the threats of eternal damnation and excommunication and things like that, they were able to force those who were primarily doing the fighting, and these are the kind of nobles, the leftovers of the power wielders of the Carolingian period. They were able to force them to stop fighting so much, to stop pillaging randomly, and so this is a really interesting movement. Again, I'll come back to that. This period also sees, that's kind of early in the period. This starts in the 10th century, continues in the 11th century, becomes a kind of institutionalized thing by the end of the 11th century or so. Part and parcel of that, or going along with that, is the creation of kingdoms. I should say the Peace of God becomes a component of the creation of the kingdoms of this period. We do not have anymore a unified Western Europe under a single ruler, as we did with Charlemagne. Instead, we see the creation of these kingdoms, and each kingdom has its own eccentricities. It's not like they're established along a single model or something like that. The Kingdom of France is very different from the Kingdom of England. It's very different from these kingdoms in northern Spain. It's certainly very different from this thing that's still called the Empire, going back to the ancient Roman Empire and to, the imperial title that Charlemagne had taken. That each of these have very unique features, and in a later lecture I will talk through some of these kingdoms and look at some specifics there. This period also sees the crystallization of what have been called feudal relationships. Now, I say that with a great deal of hesitation, and you may have noted in the textbook that our textbook author Clifford Bachman says feudalism did not exist, or at least did not as we have been led to believe in kind of popular imagination about the Middle Ages. But there were standardized, at least in some places, a great deal of regional variation, but standardized kinds of relationships that existed between people within the power hierarchies of Western Europe. And I want to problematize that a little bit later, talking about a little more about feudalism. There's been some, really important scholarship over the last 50 years or so on this, that at least among those who know about this period and have studied this period in depth, feudalism has ceased to be a concept that is useful in most ways. But we don't want to completely pitch that without explaining why the term is problematic and maybe suggesting some things to replace that, right? So there were these relationships that were, it's not like they were invented in this period, but they become crystallized in this period, and there are, kind of forces and factors that contribute to that crystallization. This is a period also of the formation of communities. Various communities at different levels. There's a great deal of urbanization in this period, for instance, and towns. Now, it's not like towns disappeared entirely in the early Middle Ages, but the High Middle Ages is characterized by a growing sense of kind of civic ethos in towns, in kingdoms themselves. The kingdom is, we might say, the largest community that exists in Europe, although there is also this notion of Christendom, that everyone is part of the Christian world, and that's the kind of meta community, we might say. But towns, and then even within towns and within regions, we have these this kind of sense of community that exists among some parts of the population. Obviously, monasteries had been communities, from early Christianity. They come to have, they partake in this building civic ethos, and monasteries in some cases take their cues from what others are doing and start to innovate in interesting ways. In some cases, monasteries are the pioneers in the innovation of this communal spirit. Jewish communities that existed in Europe, especially along major rivers, they also form this kind of civic ethos and partake in this general spirit of community building. So there are, I'll come back to these in a second, right? I'm going to suggest, for further reading, one of the most important texts written in the last 30 or so years, in my opinion, actually it was almost 30 years ago, is this book by Susan Reynolds called Kingdoms and Communities in Western Europe, 900 to 1300. That's where I'm getting a lot of this stuff about communities. And in that book, Reynolds goes through these different levels of community. She talks about towns, she talks about monasteries, she, this all leads up to this notion that that people begin to have, that we are living within a kingdom, that we are part of the kingdom of France or the kingdom of England or the empire or something like that, right? And obviously there's a great deal of variation across these different kingdoms, but that identity starts to become important to people. And then sort of, smaller scale identities are similarly important, or maybe even more important, that I am a resident of, a citizen of this town, and this town has these characteristics, and we do these things, and this is how we govern ourselves, and so forth and so on. There are some studies, and maybe I should just go back to that slide here, that point out that all of this development and crystallization of institutions in Europe has a darker side to it, right? So this book by R.I. Moore, which was originally published, the first edition was all the way back in the early 80s. There has a second edition. There may even be a third edition at this point. I'm not sure. This is a tremendously influential book. It talks about how in the process of creation, which Europe is going through at this point, right, where they're standardizing and canonizing things and creating systems, creating governments, creating bureaucracies, creating culturally and religiously a sense of what is acceptable, what is Orthodox or Catholic, and then what is not, meaning what is heresy, right? This is a second period of definition in Christianity. The first, of course, was in late antiquity with the church fathers. The 11th, 12th, 13th centuries see a kind of second period of standardization. And if you define what is acceptable, obviously anything that falls outside of the pale of acceptability is considered inimical, is considered heresy, or also communities like Jews and Muslims. Moore has a whole chapter in here on lepers. Leprosy was a disease that, was common in the Middle Ages, and, you have whole communities of lepers who were excluded from the rest of society because there's a belief that there's something wrong with them, that this is God's punishment for them, that they are cursed. And so, Moore sees this whole process of Europe becoming Europe as having a darker side to it, as the formation of a persecuting society. And obviously he is trying to find medieval roots of perhaps modern ideas or modern persecution, right? To some extent, the specter of things like the Holocaust is brooding over this study, though it's not explicit necessarily in what Moore does. I think this book is important. I do think that he overreaches a great deal in this, but it's one that students of medieval history certainly should read and engage with. It's one I would recommend, though you want to be careful, not to be drawn too much into this, because I think there's plenty of evidence that challenges a lot of what Moore is saying. A more recent study, this is 2009, I believe that this came out, is Thomas Bisson's book called The Crisis of the 12th Century. And this builds upon smaller, more regional studies that Bisson had done earlier in his career. A book I have assigned in this Medieval Europe course, and some iterations of it, is a work that he does specifically on 12th century Catalonia, called Tormented Voices. But Bisson's basic argument in both of those books, but it's definitely to its fullest extent in this book, is that with the creation of governments, with the standardization of the use of power, and with the cementing of the basic hierarchies of Europe in the High Middle Ages, that there is a crisis, that some people are excluded from this, that some people even suffer from this. And so one of the things that Bisson has commonly pointed out in a number of his studies is that, with the creation of a new bureaucracy, so say we have a new kingdom, right? He looks at Catalonia, you've got the county of Barcelona, which eventually becomes a duchy, and, it's going through these different phases. But the counts of Barcelona appoint tax collectors. They're often just peasants who are, in the right place at the right time, or know the right people or something like that. But they're given these responsibilities to collect taxes or to, be the king's representative. And they are given a great deal of autonomy to do that. And they end up exploiting the people around them. Right? And so the bureaucracies, Charlemagne had officials like the Missi Dominici, but there isn't this intensive bureaucracy that runs from the local level to the regional level to the level of the kingdom. As those sorts of things are put into place, more and more people wield power, and often without any kind of oversight or any guidance in how they should do this. It's simply go collect taxes, right? Well, of course they're going to abuse that. And this creates a crisis in power and lordship, where Europe just becomes to some extent this goes along with what Moore is saying about persecuting society, but instead of looking at, the persecution of those who fall outside of the pale of acceptability, Bisson is saying people suffer generally from the use of power, the wielding of power, the way that power is exercised in Europe in this period. And I think all of these are important studies. Bisson's book is 600 pages long. It's a difficult thing to get through, but I do think that he's pointing out important things in the introductory material for the Galbert source that you're assigned for this week. you'll find references to the crisis of the 12th century, and footnotes that lead to Bissen and things like this, right? So just be aware that, I mean, in the creation of new exercises of power, or the standardization of this, that those who don't have power tend to be exploited, tend to suffer, tend to be tormented by those who wield power. And this may, hint at something about basic human nature. We could talk about things like the Zimbardo prison experiment, or, these other things that have been done in, more recent times, to talk about why, when people get power, they tend to abuse it, or that's just a basic psychological tendency we have. But we can see that in operation in these medieval sources, and Bissen definitely does this to the nth degree. The population is growing tremendously in the High Middle Ages. Some of this has to do with climate change. This is a period generally of global warming. This is what leads, for instance, to the establishment of permanent settlements in places like Greenland, which would otherwise be totally inhospitable. By about 980, the Vikings have settled it. They've settled in Greenland. They've made it to Newfoundland by the 11th century. But climate change generally led to longer growing seasons and a greater abundance of food. There are also a number of agricultural innovations that lead to more land in cultivation, not necessarily a higher crop yield, but at least more land in cultivation and more effective cultivation of the land itself. And I'll talk about these in a later lecture. As the population grows, many people move into towns. Towns then, as I've said, form this, or have this communal ethos to them. People start to identify themselves as townspeople, and that identity is important to them, and towns tend to be wealth generators, right? So the vibrancy of Europe economically and socially is driven in large part by the urbanization of this period. Lots of new towns being founded as well, and growing up with this sense of community baked in to the establishment and the growth of the town. And just generally an uptick, significant uptick, and just generally trending upward growth of commerce and trade, right? That all go along with this. And then there's a lot of cultural development as well. A lot of this comes out of the church. This is a period of church reform. I will have a lot to say about that later in later lectures. And even something that has been identified as the 12th century Renaissance. Now you have to be clear about this. The 12th century is it's one of these long centuries that historians have created, where it's like, well, anything from this period to this period, we're just going to call the 12th century, right? So the 12th century might be variously described as like 1075 to 1215, for instance, and there are reasons for those years that have to do with the papacy. Or 1054 to, 1254 or something like that, right? I mean, they're just like these random assignments, but all of that is part of this so-called long 12th century. But the 12th century is it's a period of intense flourishing, culturally, economically, socially, politically, however we draw the chronological boundaries around it. Okay, I want to try to get through a couple of other things here, and obviously there's just a ton of stuff we can talk about, and I'm going to come back to most of this later on, right? I mentioned the Peace of God movement. So this is a major factor in the stabilization of Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries, okay? I mentioned that this is an alliance of mostly churchmen, along with some peasants and townspeople, commoners, who are sick and tired of being raided by, barons who are fighting each other, and they're easy, churches, monasteries are easy pickings. They don't have people to defend them. They often have great wealth. Peasants are also easy targets. They grow food, they store the food, and then, some robber baron comes along and pillages everything, takes their food store, and leaves them to starve to death, right? And so, this period of great instability leads to what has been called the first major mass protest movement in Western history. And there are lots of sources that document this, and they're really interesting. The one I have put here is from the early 11th century. There are some that date back as far as like a century before this, right? But this particular source, this is a chronicle. I believe this is from a guy named Drogo of Terouanne, so this is in France. In the 1038th year after the incarnation of the Lord. Now, I will mention that some of this is bound up with apocalyptic expectations, that this is around the turn of the first millennium, or the year 1033 also has some cachet, because that is the 1,000 years from the death of Christ. Christ, according to tradition, lived for 33 years. But it was the 1038th year, so this is around that time, right? Lots of apocalyptic expectations. People think the end of the world is coming. The second coming of Christ is going to happen any moment. And so, they expect these things, and they want to bring about some momentous change in preparation for that. And so, the apocalypticism of the period is often connected to this desire for greater stability. So on the 8th day of August, in the middle of the day, the sun was darkened. So there's an eclipse, it seems. And this shows that, there's something that God is cognizant of something momentous happening, and that things need to change, right? So the apocalyptic expectation. At the very same time, and I mean, these two things could be just, this is like free associations. Like, oh yeah, there was this eclipse, and then the Bishop Aymon of Bourges, did this thing right around that time, right? But they see the connection between the two as important. At this very same time, Archbishop Aymon of Bourges wished to impose peace in his diocese through the swearing of an oath. After he had summoned the fellow bishops of his province, so he's the archbishop, he's got a number of bishops within his province, right? And had sought advice from these suffragans, he bound all men of 15 years of age and over by the following law, that they would come forth with one heart as opponents of any violation of the oath they had sworn, that they would in no way withdraw secretly from the pact, even if they should lose their property, and that what is more, if necessity should demand it, they would go after those who had repudiated the oath with arms. What are they agreeing to? Well, they're agreeing that they will keep the peace, and that they will attack anyone who tries to violate peace. Anyone who attacks churches, anyone who raids peasant food stores, anyone who is engaged in warfare that is unjust in any way, right? So this is all about massive peer pressure, taking everyone 15 years of age or older. Now, they're not so worried about peasants. They're worried about people who actually have the means to fight. And so the clergy are putting pressure on the nobility here, on the knights, the ones who were prosecuting this warfare so constantly, right? And this has an effect, okay? With the help of God, they so terrified the rebels that as the coming of the faithful was proclaimed far and wide by rumor among the populace, the rebels scattered. So it seems they were able to break this cycle of warfare, people were impressed by this, and this led to stability. And they often invoke anything they can, use to impress people as part of these peace movements. He swore this, so he forces people to swear an oath over the relics of Stephen, the first martyr for Christ. How the relics of St. Stephen got to, France is an interesting story, and that's another theme that we can talk about another day. But they've got these sacred relics. Everybody believes these are the authentic remains of St. Stephen, and they swear the oath over these things, and fear and trembling then struck the hearts of the unfaithful, so that they feared the multitude of the unarmed peasantry as if they were a battle line of armored men. This is kind of an amazing phenomenon here, right? Where churchmen who are not wielding weapons and peasants who are just sick and tired of being raided all the time come together, and they force those engaged in this warfare to stop fighting. I mean, obviously not entirely, but enough pressure is put on them that the unjust warfare they had been conducting is curbed significantly. We might even say exponentially, right? And And so, there's a lot more we can say about the Peace of God movement. But if you want to look into this a little more, there are a lot of interesting sources on this on the Internet Medieval Sourcebook. This becomes a factor in a lot of things. This is invoked during the Crusades. We'll look at the speech of Urban II later in the term, and we'll see, again, this evocation of peace, right? And this desire that Christian knights should not be fighting each other, they should not be fighting other Christians. We got to find some better outlet. Let's go fight the Muslims, right? This peace movement has an effect on that. All right, I think I have run too long. I did want to talk about feudalism as a concept, but I think I'm going to do a second video to talk about that. It's something that'll take more than just a couple of minutes, so let's call it good for now.